Where did it go? Tell you what I'll do. I'll still pull this up, but let me show you what I mean here. By the way, I've been teaching you this stuff from day one, and so hopefully this word isn't going to scare you too much because I've already scared you with it once. The word again is algebra, and I'm going to show you the algebraic way to figure out how much we would have to sell a property for them to make a certain amount of money. But then I'm going to trick you into doing algebra without even realizing you're doing algebra with this type of math. It's very easy to do if you just follow exactly what I'm going to show you. So here's the math packet. Let me find the net to seller math. Here we go. So none of these are incredibly difficult overall, but let me show you, as I said, the longhand way to do this so you fully understand why it works, and then I'm going to trick you into doing it without having to actually think about it, okay? If we were looking at this one right here, at what price must a property sell to give the seller a net of $60,000 after paying the broker a 6% commission, paying off a $480 lien, and paying closing costs of $850? So what we've got is this scenario where we're like, okay, well, we know their cost and we know how much they want to make. So we need to know what they're going to sell the property for. And remember, I told you the simplest form of algebra is solving for an unknown variable. So in other words, sorry, a couple of you are giving me a complex with cameras tonight by just disappearing, making my life difficult. Don't do that. So I want you to see the equation here, okay? And tell me if this makes sense to you. We don't know what they're going to sell the property for, but can we agree that 100% of the sales price minus 6% of the sales price, meaning sales price minus the commission, minus $480 lien, minus $850 in closing costs, needs to equal the seller's net of $60,000. Does that equation make sense to you, right? If we had the purchase price minus commission minus closing costs needs to net them $60,000. Everybody with me here? And so algebra, once again, is finding the value of this unknown. And so if you do something on one side of the equation, you do it to the other side. And so we could add 850 to this side. So we add 850 to this side. That kills it. Add 480 to this side. Add 480 to this side. Okay, well, 100% of P minus 6% of P leaves you with 94% of P. So now we're really saying 94% of P equals these numbers all together. And so, of course, if you add up all those numbers, you are looking at 60,000 plus 850 plus 480 for 61,330, but we're still not done because we need to know the purchase price is. So 94% of the purchase price needs to equal this. Well, if you divide by 94% on this side and you divide by 94% on this side, you now have the value of P. So 61,330 divided by 94% tells you that you would need to sell this property for $65,244.68. Chelsea, there you go, loving the math again. Yeah. And you can check your work, folks. Here's the beautiful thing about math. Now, if you didn't like that, I'm going to make it so much better, I promise. Just hang tight. But, folks, here's how you can check your work. Because now, okay, well, our commission is 6%. So if we take 6% off the top, that means that the seller would be left with 94%. So multiply it by 94%. Then subtract out their tax lien they had to pay of $480. Then subtract out the other closing cost of $850. And they're left with $60,000 in net. So we solved the answer here. Now, let me show you the trick. You ready for this? Some of you hated that. That's fine. I'm telling you why it works. Now listen to me. When you are dealing with a net to seller math problem like this, I'm going to tell you the trick to always get it right in the easiest way possible. Okay, I want you to look at the one we just did. I want you to add up every single number you see that's not commissions. Add them all up together. That's not commission. And then once you find that total, divide it by what is left over from 100% when you take the commission out. So in other words, what's left over from 100%? 94%, because you take 6% out. So try it for me. Add up every single number you see that is not commission, total it out, and then divide by 0.94 and tell me what you get. Got excited because like three of you got like threw the answer out for me like right away, and then everybody else is like, nah. Let's say it again. Add up every single number you see that has nothing to do with commission, total them up, and then divide by 0.94 and tell me what you got. And hopefully, even those of you who are not putting anything in the chat got the same answer that everybody else did. 65,244.68. In other words, the answer that I just worked out with you with the long algebraic way, folks. Tell me that way is not so much simpler. And it works every single time as long as you pay attention. And if you don't believe me, try this one. Same thing here. I mean, read the question, sure, but add up every single number you see that's not commission. In this instance, there's 2 of them. And divide by what is left over percentage-wise after you take 6% from 100. So in other words, yet again, add these 2 numbers, total them out, and then divide by 0.94. Tell me what you get. So in this case, we've got 90,000, which is what they want to net, plus $500 in closing costs. Oops, too many zeros. Divided by 0.94. 96,276.56, or I'm sorry, 60, depending on how you rounded. Try another one. Same thing here. Same methodology, right? You got slightly bigger numbers, really doesn't change anything. Outstanding mortgage of $21,275. Plus they want to net $50,000. Those are the only numbers we got. Yep. Yet again, it's 6% commission. Of course, be careful. It's not always going to be 6% commission. But in this instance, it is, again, divide by 0.94. 75,824, or C. Folks, pretty easy, right? When you realize that that's the trick to it. It's algebra, and I showed you why it works. Because what we're really saying, just so we can all put it together again in our heads, 100% of this unknown sales price minus 6% of this unknown sales price minus 21,275 needs to equal their desired net of $50,000, which is why it works the way I said. Because if you add 21,275 on this side, you would add it to this side. And so that's where we're getting the add up all the numbers you see. And then once you take 6% from 100% commission, you're left with the 94%, and you divide it, and it all works out. So I'm just tricking you into doing math in a much easier way, more specifically algebra in a much simpler way. What you got, Brooks?
Yeah, I put that equation into my calculator, and it gave me something completely different.
Make sure that you have totaled the two numbers out. So go 21,275 plus.
That's what I didn't do.
50,000. You've got to equal it out. Otherwise, order of operations is going to screw you up. Yep. You've got to hit that equals and get the final number. You can't just put divided by 0.94, because then it's going to try to do it to that one number. And you could throw it off. So, yeah, you've got to make sure you hit equals and get the total and then divide by 0.94. Just out of curiosity, let's see what happens if you do that. 21,275 plus 50,000 divided by... See, I guess it just depends on the calculator, because mine's going to still work it out the same, because it finishes the equation before it moves on, but some don't. Some is, if you're using a calculator that just leaves the string of numbers, it's going to use order of operations, and then you're going to be screwed because division comes before addition. Yep. Yeah. So nothing too crazy there. Obviously it's pretty straightforward math once you kind of get a grasp on it. So just be careful. Let's switch gears now and talk about buyers. Okay, we talked about the listing agreements. We talked about sellers. We talked about a lot of different things that come in play. We're working with sellers. Now we're going to get into the buyer agency side of things. And of course, we've got lots of different options for how we can work with buyers. We can start off with an oral buyer agency agreement, which is always non-exclusive and open-ended. Still has to be expressed, right? Clearly stated. Talk about money. Talk about dual agency. Talk about when it would have to be reduced to writing. Of course, there are written non-exclusive buyer agency agreements as well. And so remember that word exclusive when we're talking about agency agreements. That means us to them. I'm sorry, that means them to us. Let me rephrase that. Them to us. So if they sign an exclusive buyer agency agreement, they're not allowed to have another buyer agent or another buyer agent firm. If they sign a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement, we are not binding them to work with only us. They can work with other people as well. And there is a written one, just like there is an oral one, right? Either one is fine. And then, of course, the exclusive buyer agency agreement being the most common, where we bind them to work with us and only us. And so when we're dealing with buyer agency agreements, of course, it's really going to outline the obligations between the buyer and the firm, which is the agent. And it's going to talk about things like what we expect to make, of course, duties we owe to the buyer, duties the buyer owes to us, and the type of property they're looking for. Now, remember, these are not property specific. They are very vague in the property that we're looking for. So let me show you the buyer agency agreement. And I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this one as we did the listing agreement. Why? A lot of similarities between the two. So I just want to focus on certain specifics. I'll come back to this one, but here is right there. So here's the exclusive buyer agency agreement. And so it's going to bind them to work with only our brokerage firm, saying they cannot have another buyer's agent. And much like the language in the listing agreement, it starts off talking about how it's between the buyer and the firm, right? This exclusive buyer agency agreement is entered into on this date between buyer and firm. And then, of course, the agent who signs this will be primarily responsible, but firm means everybody within the firm, dealing with that sub-agency concept. This also has that little disclaimer saying that, well, hey, if you're entering into an exclusive buyer agency agreement with us, then you better not be in a relationship with somebody else, because this is exclusive. And you have already received the working with real estate agents disclosure if you're about to sign this. Now, here's the big difference, right? On the listing agreement, we name the property address and partial legal descriptions. Here, when we're talking about the type of property, it's vague. Are they looking for residential or commercial or something different, like raw land or something specific? And then when we put in general location, folks, the vast majority of buyer agency agreements I fill out says something like Wake County and surrounding areas. Very vague. It's not property specific, and ergo would not die with destruction of the property. Now, just like any other one, there is the effect of the agreement, how long it's going to go on for, has to have that definite expiration date. And so the term of this agreement shall begin on whatever date and shall terminate as follows. Now, don't let this confuse you, because fulfillment of purpose kills every contract. And they're not going to try to trip you up on this. But this does have a provision where you could help somebody who was searching to buy more than one property, like an investor. If you had an investor purchasing 10 properties, you could fill out 10 buyer agency agreements, or you could pick this second one. And so it depends on if you're looking for one property or two. So if a buyer is intending to purchase a single property, this agreement shall terminate when the buyer acquires that property or on 11:59 p.m. on this date. If you do the second option, what we're saying is it would not automatically terminate if they bought a house, because they're trying to buy more than one house, and it would only die on a certain date. Is that going to be something they throw at you on the test? No. So don't get it confused, right? Fulfillment of purpose does kill contracts, but this one does have that special provision in there. Now, here's where the compensation side looks different. Remember in the listing agreement, we said, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, our firm's going to charge you this, and of this, excuse me, we're going to share this much with a cooperating buyer's agent or seller sub-agent or both. This one says, well, here's what we expect to make. And this is where it talks about retainer fees, okay? It says, firm acknowledges a receipt of a non-refundable retainer fee in the amount of blank, which shall or shall not be credited towards any compensation due firm under this agreement. Is this going to be heavily testable? No. But let me explain a retainer fee. If you have ever utilized an attorney services, you're familiar with retainers. When you call an attorney and you want them to work on a case or a lawsuit or something like that, they will typically have a retainer like $3,000, which means you've got to hand them $3,000 up front for them to start working for you. And then they'll charge you something like, $200 an hour and start working on your case. And so every single time they work an hour, they're basically deducting $200 from that retainer you gave them. And once they have worked enough to blow the whole $3,000, they will say, okay, well, I can't keep working until you give me another $3,000 retainer. It's basically like a prepayment to ensure that they are going to work for you. Do we do it to that same extent? No. And is it a common practice? Not necessarily. But because of the nature of being a buyer's agent, where you've got to show people homes and drive around and waste gas and do things, sometimes brokerages will charge a retainer fee to buyers to ensure that they are actually serious buyers and not tire kickers, as we like to say, that are going to waste our time and then not buy anything. It would be up to your firm on whether this is going to be a standard of practice or not. So that is a retainer fee. The actual compensation, though, comes into play right here. Buyer agrees that the firm's fee for services hereunder shall be in the amount of 2%, 3%, $500, $6,000. It could be a flat fee. It could be a percentage. Doesn't matter. And so here's where the interesting language comes into play. I told you, under the common law of agency and those fiduciary duties, could you refuse to take your buyers to a home that was offering you $1 in commission? What did we say? Yeah, no, right? Because their needs, wants, and desires come before our own. That's that loyalty piece. But I did tell you that we could expect them to pay us. And that's what this says. Here's how much we expect to make. And so our firm will seek the fee from a cooperating listing firm through the listing firm's offer of compensation in the MLS or otherwise, or from the seller if there is no listing firm. And the buyer agrees that the firm shall be entitled to receive the same in consideration for the firm services hereunder. So first and foremost, we're going to try to get paid from the seller or the listing firm for our compensation. Still the most common practice. However, if the buyer purchases property where compensation offered by the listing firm and or the seller is less than the fee we agreed, or where no compensation is offered by the listing firm or seller, buyer and firm agree that the buyer will pay the difference between the fee and the compensation offered unless prohibited by law, and the firm will timely inform buyer of the compensation offered is less than expected. And so this goes back to what I said. We're not going to refuse to take them to the place that's only offering us $1. But we can look at them and say, hey, just so you know, they're offering us $1 in compensation. I will ask if they'd be willing to up it to the 3% that I'm looking to make as we agreed to in our buyer agency agreement. And if they're not, you may be on the hook. I may expect you to pay me the other $9,999 or whatever the fee equates to. And if they don't want to look at that house anymore, that's their prerogative, right? They don't have to. If they would rather buy a house where the compensation is being offered as opposed to shelling it out of pocket, that's fine. Now, this last piece talks about the additional compensation. Remember, in North Carolina, you can accept additional compensation, legally speaking, so long as you disclose it to your clients in writing before they make or accept an offer. And that's what this is stating here, that we would disclose it timely in writing if there is any compensation being offered to us in excess of what we agreed to on here. The other big difference for the buyer agency agreement is the triggers for when we have earned our compensation. Remember, on the listing agreement, it was if we procured a ready, willing, and able buyer at terms acceptable to the seller. Of course, also if they sold the home or if they breached the contract, things of that nature. This one says the compensation shall be deemed earned under any of the following circumstances. 1, if during the term of this agreement, buyer, any assignee of buyer, or any person or legal entity acting on behalf of buyer directly or indirectly enters into an agreement to purchase, option, and or exchange any property of the type described above, regardless of the manner in which the buyer was introduced to the property. So folks, let me explain this in the real world. If you were to sign a buyer agency agreement with a broker, and let's say that you were to go into a new construction community one weekend without your agent. Some builders have a policy that states we will not compensate your agent unless they're there with you on your first walk-in to meet with us. And so if you walk into a neighborhood without your agent, but you have a buyer agency agreement in place, and some on-site agent sells you on a house and talks you into it and fills a contract, and you sign a contract right then and there, that builder may refuse to pay your agent. But legally speaking, your agent could go after you for the compensation. Why? Because you entered into a contract with a buyer agency agreement in place. You see how that says? It's triggered. If you enter into a contract to buy a house that was mentioned above, we've earned our fee. And so we really go on later that says, hey, listen, you understand that as your agent, you need to include us in anything. Do not go negotiate without us. Do not go see houses without us. Do not do anything like that because you could get yourself in trouble. Because we're your agent and we're here to work for you and help you get the best deal and look after your best interest. Now, of course, the other trigger is that same protection period. If within blank period of days after the expiration of this agreement, you try to buy a house that we introduced to you, we could be entitled to compensation still. Tail clause, extended clause, protection period. Same thing here. And then, of course, the last one says, if having entered into an enforceable contract to acquire property during the term of this agreement, the buyer defaults under the terms of that contract. So in other words, they breach, default, don't fulfill their agreement. The reason why that's a little confusing in North Carolina is because when they get under contract, most of the time they have a due diligence period, which gives them the right to back out. So that's not considered a default if they terminate during due diligence, and ergo we've not earned our commission if they terminate during due diligence because they haven't breached, they haven't defaulted, and they're allowed to do that. And we would just help them get another house. What you got, Brooks?
So, like it says, within, let's say, 180 days of being introduced to a house, they decide to go buy the house with a different agent. Are they liable to pay both compensations, or is it just ours?
No, it's actually just the other. And so it says that in both the listing agreement and this one, it clearly states that if they enter into another agreement, it sucks to suck for us. So that's what it says right here. Unless the buyer has entered into a valid buyer agency agreement with another real estate firm. So even if, like, let's say, Brooks, you and I had a buyer agency agreement, I took you to see 123 Main Street, and you're like, I'm thinking about it. And then maybe your credit wasn't where it needed to be. You couldn't buy it. You decided to wait. Our buyer agency agreement ended. And then 6 months later, your credit's on point. You call somebody else, not me. You call Bill to be your agent, and you go back and you buy 123 Main Street. Now that you've hired a new agent, even if it was in that period of time that I had, I wouldn't really be able to go after you for a commission because now you got a new agent who's representing you. Which is why in a lot of instances, in the real world, that protection period is kind of useless. It's very seldom that we can actually enforce that, but it's just really for specific scenarios where we know they're trying to circumvent us and kick us out of the deal. Of course, the compensation due and payable piece, distribution of proceeds from sale of the property by the closing attorney or upon buyer's default, whichever. The only other things that really change or differ here, same things required, right? Non-discrimination provisions, signatures of all the parties, definite termination date, dual agency provisions are all the same, whether we can do designated or not. All that's outlined the same. Yeah, that's it. Buyer agency agreement is a lot more straightforward. So just kind of understanding the differences between the triggers for when we have earned our compensation between the, listing agreement and the buyer agency agreement. Going to be big pieces there. Remember the other thing we told you too, folks, you got to be very careful. If on the buyer agency agreement, okay, in the dual agency section, the buyer authorizes dual agency. Are we a dual agent? See a couple heads doing things. I like the all caps there, Janet. No. Not yet. Folks, remember, we always start off as an exclusive representative of them initially, right? Because if there is no seller yet, that means we only care about the buyer, right? It's exclusive buyer agency. They're our person, and we only care about the buyer. And so even if they authorize dual agency, we are not a dual agent until what? What would make us a dual agent in this buyer agency discussion? This says the same transaction, more specific. There you go, Bree. They want to buy an in-house listing, right? They are interested in purchasing a listing where the seller is represented by our brokerage firm as well. Because if we have a buyer agency agreement and they authorize dual agency and we take them to see 200 different listings from other firms, we've still just given them exclusive buyer representation. But the second they want to see a listing that's listed by our firm, that would turn into dual agency. And if it's just dual, it's worthless, and now you got to sit down, shut up, bound and gagged and worthless. And of course, if it's designated, because we've clearly stated such, then we could go for blood. There you go. Of course, this is just a general understanding of working with buyers, working with real estate agents disclosure is piece number 1. Of course, forming a relationship with them with a buyer agency agreement is step number 2, because we don't work for them until they hire us, whether through an oral agreement or a written one. Pre-qualifying a buyer, we're going to talk about that in the financing section and the math that goes with it. Folks, let me give you a word of caution for the real world. Somebody needs to pre-qualify the buyer, but it's not us, right? The lender needs to do that. You need to have a basic understanding of qualifying a buyer and credit criteria and credentials and things of that nature, but we're not the ones doing it. Of course, we identify properties that may be suitable. We schedule showings. We take them to go see them. We help discover and disclose material facts, do research on the property to make sure that they have all information to make good, adequate decisions, verify information on restrictive covenants, any HOAs, things that would prevent them from using the property how they saw fit, all of the above. Of course, too, folks, we talked about a CMA for sellers. We also should do a CMA for buyers. Why?
Because they want to know how much they're actually going to pay at closing.
Well, not necessarily how much they're going to pay at closing, because the CMA is just really, because we're not talking about the net sheet, right? We do need to kind of look at, what the total cost is going to be, but we need to help them determine what a reasonable price is for the house. And there you go. Y'all are all kind of getting there. Folks, remember what we said. We have to follow our client's lawful, willful instructions. So that being the case, there's a potential that a list price is not the most actual price, right? They could have decided they wanted to list it high for someone to talk them down or just to see if they could get it. So if we as agents say, well, hey, listen, just pay what it's listed at, we're doing a disservice to our clients. We're not looking after their best interests. So we would equally want to do a CMA for a buyer to ensure that it's a good price based on the market for a buyer, as we would for a seller when we list it. Chelsea says, what if right before closing the loan changes from conventional to FHA? Can the seller back out? Chelsea, this sounds like an oddly specific question.
My friend was asking me about it the other day because I think that theirs is changing right at the very end.
Yeah, see, I can tell when these questions are triggered by real life experiences, because I'm like, this is not something that came up in textbook reading. Here's the thing. That would be considered a material fact in North Carolina, right? Facts about the, ability of the principal to complete the transaction. So you should tell the seller that. Arguably, though, it doesn't automatically give them the right to back out. If they're going to be closing on time, and as long as, certain crazy things hasn't happened, there is no legal precedent that says that the seller can back out because of it. However, if you were to say that you were paying conventional or cash from the word go, knowing very well that you were going to be an FHA buyer and you lied, that could void the contract, right? They could arguably get out of it at that point. But if things changed and it was just a, sheer happenstance thing, there is no automatic out for the seller now. But they should be disclosed that. So they're made aware of it. Yeah. Of course, aside from doing the CMA to figure out what a reasonable price is, we are going to assist them in preparing the offer. Folks, we fill out the offer and we tell them what we think they should offer, but they are the ultimate decision makers, as we've said before. And then, of course, we've got to assist them in preparing for closing. We help schedule inspections, and we help make sure that the lenders get everything that they need. And, of course, re-inspections and, all of that fun-filled jazz would fall into these things as well. Of course, we've already talked about a lot of different pieces here, folks. Oral buyer agency agreements, I've told you time and time again, they are legal. You have to answer the test as such. We've already talked about what they have to be and what they can't be.
Are you allowed to lie on a listing in regards to why a sale fell through?
No.
Okay.
An agent, well, nobody's allowed to lie.
Yeah.
So remember, in the doctrine of caveat emptor, sellers don't have to disclose things, but they can't lie. But brokers are legally obligated to disclose all material facts. So if a house was under contract and then a home inspection revealed issues and the buyer terminated because of the issues, if the agent failed to disclose those issues, they have committed an omission of a material fact and are subject to disciplinary action.
What if a buyer terminated because of personal reasons? Because of a family matter. So before we moved here, we were about to close on a house in Atlanta. And 2 days before, we realized my sister was really sick. We needed to move here in the next few months.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to back out 2 days before closing. And we explained to them. And then within an hour, they reposted the home and they were like, the buyers didn't have the down payment money, so they could buy the house. That was the reason.
Yeah, so there is a
I was like, how rude.
yeah, so that's not something they should have said. But there is a stigma. So going back to what I was saying, if a house falls through, people automatically assume there's something wrong with the house. And so the biggest thing that listing agents will do to make people feel okay that it was not the house is they will say something like house back on the market through no fault of seller or buyer, personal reasons or something like that. So that's where they should have probably drawn the line. It's just said something like buyer's personal reasons, because that's not really something they should have said. That's technically not obviously the literal case, but I'm sure they were just trying to make an extreme point of it was the buyer, not the seller. I mean, if you felt a certain kind of way about it, you probably could have called the commission and complained about it, but I don't know that that would be egregious enough for them to actually take disciplinary action, but they probably would have looked into it, maybe given them a slap on the wrist. But no, they should not have made up stuff, because that's not the exact reason. But, who knows what your agent, said to them too. I mean, because your agent was the one that communicated to them. So, they may have just had to make an assumption, because when your agent said, well, they're backing out, I don't know. Yeah. So we're talking about the buyers, and we're about to wrap up the agency agreement section because we've been hitting all of the different pieces, which means that we get into basic contract law in a second. But oral buyer agency agreements, definitely something you have to be aware of for the test. We've already talked about them. Okay, they have to be express, meaning clearly stated. I'm trying to warn you folks about things you're going to see on the test. If I said which of the following is true in regard to an oral buyer agency agreement, and one of the options was must discuss compensation and whether or not dual agency can be practiced, that is true. Okay, that is true. Also, let me give you another piece of clarity here, folks. If all you have is an oral buyer agency agreement, then all you can have is oral consent to dual agency. Meaning that if you've got an oral buyer agency agreement and your buyer client wants to see a home listed by your firm, you would need them to orally consent to dual agency, saying, yes, I understand that this is dual agency. Yes, I'm okay with it, and allow it to happen. But it would have to be reduced to a written dual agency agreement whenever you reduce it to a written buyer agency agreement. Also understand that seller's consent to dual agency has to be in writing from the offset, because their agency agreements have to always be in writing as well. So you can have oral dual buyer agency consent if all you have is an oral agreement. But if you have a written agreement from the offset, then the dual agency consent needs to be in writing from the offset. So non-exclusive, open-ended, is legal, has to be reduced to writing prior to making an offer on behalf of a buyer as their buyer agent. So here is a question for you. If my clicker works. True or false, a buyer's agent is required to perform a comparative market analysis for their client prior to their client making an offer. Let me help you out, because some of you are, I'm sure, as I've instilled fear into you about absolutes, and some of you are probably getting caught up in that word required. Let me rephrase the question. It is exceptionally advisable that we do a CMA for a buyer client before submitting an offer. Answer it that way. Yeah. Folks, I guess it's not legally required, but we would be failing in our duties as an agent if we didn't do it, right? Because we have to protect the public and act in a competent manner. So while the law doesn't necessarily state a buyer's agent has to, we're probably arguably in violation of other rules, like acting in a way of being unworthy or incompetent to endanger our clients. So by proxy to other laws, would it be legally required? Yeah, arguably. So, we've already talked about this. Hopefully this is still kind of sinking in with you folks. The difference between an employee and an independent contractor. We introduced this on like the first couple of days when we were talking about you being, licensees and affiliating with brokerage firms. You are an independent contractor, which means you're really self-employed. There's no taxes withheld. You get your full brokerage compensations, and you kind of have this relationship with your brokerage firm. And then, of course, an employee would be somebody who can actually have their schedule dictated, would have to have taxes withheld, and everything in between. I'm not saying that employees don't exist in the real estate world. They're just a lot less common. Most licensees are acting as independent contractors or self-employed persons at their brokerage firms that they're affiliated with. But there is, admins. The broker in charge is very often considered an employee. So there is employment roles. But hopefully everybody kind of understands the difference between independent contractor and employee, at least in a nutshell. So let me ask you another question as we wrap up this section. True or false? North Carolina seller is aware of a significant defect within their property. Regarding this defect, the seller may answer no representation on the RPODS form. This is true. No representation is I plead the fifth. They are allowed to not say anything, okay? Sellers have the right of the doctrine of caveat emptor. They don't have to disclose nothing about nothing to nobody. They just can't commit fraud or lie. But real estate brokers always have to discover and disclose all reasonably ascertainable material facts regardless of how the seller answers the RPODS form. How about this one? True or false? In North Carolina, an oral buyer agency agreement must include agreement on compensation and whether or not dual agency will be practiced. True. I keep saying this over and over again, okay? Even oral buyer agency agreements have to be expressed, clearly stated. Talk the terms. What does this entail? What does our relationship look like? Right? That they can cancel anytime, that would have to be reduced to writing prior to making an offer, that they would need to give us consent to dual agency, that we expect to be compensated, that we're going to seek the compensation from the listing firm, so on and so forth. All of these things would need to be discussed, part of that express piece of things. Which wraps up our agency agreements section. Of course, price fixing, group boycotting, and allocation of markets are all big prohibited acts under the Sherman Antitrust Act, aka antitrust laws. Open listing, multiple firms, only the one who brings the buyer is entitled to compensation. Seller retains the right to sell it themselves. Net listing, that is where we said that we agree to market the property and sell it, and anything we sell it for in excess of what the seller expects, we are going to keep not illegal, but frowned upon because of the high likelihood for impropriety potential. Of course, the protection agreement, the one you use as a buyer's agent dealing with a for sale by owner to inform them that they are not represented and that they are confirming that they're going to pay her compensation. The extender clause, also called the tail clause, also called the protection period, helps protect that you get paid in an agency contract that terminates before you did your job if they try to sell or buy a property that you introduced them to in their respective agency agreements. And then puffing, we talked about way earlier. That was an exaggeration in marketing. That is not the same thing as a misrepresentation, right? Prettiest view of the ocean. It is subjectively true to somebody. It's not illegal. Okay? If you say prettiest view of the ocean and there is no view of the ocean, that's a misrepresentation. That is a problem.